I also met last fall Dr. Kamau Bobb, and he actually is rather good at this. And he is with us today to talk about systems investment when it comes to talent, equity, and tech. And I'm honored that we'll be working with Kamau over the next year and with companies who are interested to really explore this issue and what investments companies can make. And I'm particularly excited because he is one of those leaders and minds that is deeply knowledgeable, but incredibly effective and compassionate from an educator's approach, but also has the ability to hold you accountable and deliver uncompromising expectations for what we should be doing here for the long term. And with that, let me introduce Dr. Kamau Bobb.
Good morning. First, let me make sure that this is the green button I'm supposed to press. I am a little bit of an interloper here. I'm the government. So by virtue of that, let me just, by introduction, the National Science Foundation is one of the federal granting agencies. We support basic research in STEM education and all the STEM fields. For you wonky folks, it was started the NSF Act of 1950, right out of World War II. The intent out of Vannevar Bush and his cohorts was to make sure that basic research was protected. The idea that you just want to be able to know for the sake of knowing. So just kind of my introduction to what we do. But I've since learned that Barb is going around the country, finding people, meeting them, and bringing them here. So I see how the recruitment is working. And first I thought I was special, and now I realize that everybody's doing that. That said, there are a couple things. This idea of systemic investments for equity, talent, and tech. What I would like ultimately to do is that the STEM education, the STEM workforce issue now is kind of a part of the national conversation. And I think for many of you, particularly that are involved in philanthropic activities in your respective organizations, I'm sure you, like we, are being requested endlessly to try to figure out, we have a program, we want you to invest in it, we have this initiative, we want you to invest in it to help STEM education, we want to bring more of the American childhood experiences involved in STEM experiences such that you can have a more robust workforce. I'm assuming that that's the nature of kind of the relationship that you have with this STEM space. But what does that mean? Let's start with the end. This comes from Anthony Carnevale at the Center for Education and the Workforce at Georgetown. And what it's showing, forgive the font being a little small, what it's showing is the segregation in higher education. So from 1995 to about 2007, the enrollment in post-secondary institutions in the United States almost doubled. That by itself is a fantastic testament to the way that the country has been enabled to make post-secondary education available for all people. But what it also says, there that you may not be able to see, is that looking to your left, there are 468 of the most selective institutions in the United States. I believe heard yesterday there was some rivalry between Duke and North Carolina State. I went to Berkeley, my wife went to MIT. We have, exactly, see? But those nearly 4,000 schools on the right-hand side are the open access schools. The level of funding per instructor at those schools is a fraction of what it is at the schools on the left. And basically the workforce, particularly from companies like yours, from the popular idea when we're thinking about the workforce in the context of corporate engagement, certainly in the government sectors that are elite, everything happens to the left. But what the segregation that has happened is that in that new enrollees over the last 20 years, almost 80% of the new enrollees at the 468 most selective institutions have been white. And almost 70% of the new enrollees at the open access schools have been black and Hispanic. and other students of color, and poor students of all kinds. That segregation limits the potential of those students irrespective of what you say, because we know that it's true. So there is essentially the heart of the problem. So when we're talking about investments in this larger STEM landscape, we have to be clear about where we're talking about. So the bottom side of that is about the educational infrastructure. If you're dealing with K-12 and programs for engagement and in bringing in people into the fold in terms of making their experiences such that they can have access to what some of these things are, that's where that happens. On the other side is talent acquisition. If you want to go recruiting somewhere, where do you actually recruit? And you have to make decisions about that too. So let me speedily go through this. Green button. So this is another graph that I like. And it resonates quite well, I think, with what David spoke about this morning. And you'll probably hear more about it again this afternoon. This is segregation in New York. The country at the moment is stunningly segregated. Atlanta, where I live, is the second most segregated place in the United States. Chicago, in fact, is the most segregated city in the United States. And you have to be diverse to be segregated. One implies the other. So as we heard this morning, some of you didn't, but as we heard this morning, Chicago is one of the places that kind of represents the demographics of the country. But the people don't live together. And in New York, that's true too. So you see Central Park, blue is white, red is Asian, so you can see Chinatown there at the bottom of Manhattan. Brooklyn, where I'm from, that whole green section over there, that's Brooklyn. That's kind of black Brooklyn. Then if you see those two little white spots, that's Prospect Park, and then Park Slope is to the left. You can see people don't live together. And what are the implications of that? The implications of that are, if you think about this as a ratio, with education and citizenship in the numerator and segregation in the denominator, the extent to which the segregation expands, it limits the potential of education and citizenship. As segregation goes to zero, we can achieve the infinite possibilities of education and citizenship. But because we're so segregated, we don't recognize that that's what is actually happening, because those others are others. They're somewhere else. We need to do something to them, to fix them, but we don't really want them close. And there is where I think, in we're dealing with this educational investments, we have to, again, be clear about what is the underpinning philosophy of what we're actually trying to do. And this problem is central, I think, again, like Barb, I was inspired this morning by David to what is the meaning of citizenship and our mutual responsibility to each other. Notwithstanding, I'm a program officer at NSF and I STEM all day, I don't really believe that that is the objective. The objective is, how do we get our generations of people to be able to be civic contributors such that they can bear the responsibility of each other, of us and us to them. I think that's the point. And I also believe, like Balaji said yesterday, that this computational skill set is something that's central to be able to make people able to look and analyze and critique with clarity what the country's problems actually are. And then when you have the computational tools, the analytical, logical, ordering sets of thinking, you can derive solutions. And the education piece is what enables you to be courageous enough to engage with what those solutions might be. So these things are all interconnected in my mind. So on the giving side of this, what does it really mean? I know that a lot of firms, certainly at NSF, we are kind of under bombardment for how it is that we can give to support X program. And as I mentioned before, I don't want to be flip about it, but you hear STEM is as if something you can go buy. I'm going to go get me a STEM. And they're selling STEM on the corner of 38th and 4th, and I can just go get it. We forget that it's an acronym. It's not a word. Science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and computing. The C is silent, and computing. So how do you do that? For those of you who are here, I'm quite sure that your educational experiences were formal. You went to the left, I'm assuming, as I did. So if you want to go, for example, to study engineering, I studied experimental solid mechanics at Berkeley. If you want to do that, a little side program is not going to get you there. The rigor is what's necessary. So if we look at this spectrum, what I have here, if you think about it, on one side there's engagement, which is a prerequisite for learning. Students have to be exposed to what it is that they would like to do. You can't aspire to something if you don't know what it is. So that's where the trigger of these base engagement programs is. And there's a ton of investment there because the metrics are easy. I engaged with 1,000 students over the weekend. They all came to this robotics camp, and there they were. And I had my little pre- and post-test, and afterward they had a self-efficacy measure that went up 15% that says that they can now see themselves as engineers. That's great. But then what? What happens on Monday when they go back to school and they don't have algebra, advanced placement calculus, BC calculus? They don't have those courses. So you've done well. The optics are great because it always makes for nice pictures. I've been on the brochure of every school I've ever been to. At first, I thought it was because I was cute, but then I realized that they wanted to show that they'd done this program with a young African-American male. I've been on posters all over the place. And then, as I said, I realized that I was being pimped. But that is one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is, how do you engage with the formal infrastructure that gives students the rigor to be in the circles that we are? This is where, if you circle back to the philosophy, this is where the segregation breaks down. In order to break those barriers of segregation, it's a rigorous education that will get you there. These programs that are often engagement are limited at that end. They're effective, they're necessary. I'm not deriding them, be clear. But what I am saying is that they will only take you so far. And because of the circumstances that the segregation that we're in constrains students and their communities, those programs are not enough to get them out. So then we have to think about what is it that you do on the other end of that spectrum. And that's where it becomes tricky, because it's not as easy to market that. The pictures aren't clear. How do you get someone to and through algebra into advanced placement computer science such that they get a 4 or a 5? How do you do that? That's a different kind of partnership. And this is where I think the ecosystem matters. So I don't like showing ugly numbers. But by ecosystem, what I mean is that the interface between formal and informal education is where we ultimately have to have the partnerships, I think, that you all represent. It's clear that the educational reformation at the moment is operating in triage mode. We don't really know what to do. We have charter schools, choice ideas, the public school systems themselves. In the South, they're trying to separate the bottom 20% of schools from the others, the underperforming schools, saying that those schools have been generationally underperforming students, predominantly Black and Hispanic students. So they want to separate them and take the autonomy out of the local school districts and give it to the governors. That might be fine in saying, well, we have to do something. But if you think about the logic, that brings us back to 1953, where we have two separate school systems. Because the systems that do work are for the white and more privileged kids, and the others are for the browner and poorer kids. So there's the logic. So ultimately, what we're trying to do is figure out how, in this collaborative, I think, that we have, to make sure that we can be clear about where in the spectrum we are, and ultimately what kind of mode of engagement is going to get us to the workforce and ultimately the citizenry that we aspire to. So what this is showing you is the magnitude of the problem. There are 50 million public school students in the United States right now, and we are at an inflection point where they're becoming darker and poorer. 3.5 million high school graduates. And in the context of here, I know that your firms do a whole range of different things, but certainly in the tech firms that we're concerned with, there are 98,000 engineering graduates in the entire country in 2015. Just more than 50,000 computer information science engineering graduates in the entire United States in 2015. And that doesn't include the for-profit schools and so on. That's a whole different discussion that we'll have later. But what I'm saying is that this challenge is not just a challenge of workforce, equity, and tech. It's a challenge of how do we engage the coming generation in a manner that can undo segregation, promote citizenship, and as a byproduct of that, make people who are able, skilled, willing, and prepared to be a part of the workforce. The workforce, in my view, is just a step towards citizenship. So ultimately, that's what we'll be discussing later on this afternoon. But I would leave you with the idea that this STEM education piece is on the path towards a greater sense of collective and communal responsibility. Thank you.